So it's a tremendous pleasure to be here today. Maybe I ought to begin by telling you a story. She mentioned she was surprised that I was on the Olympic basketball team. Well, that might be my first Russian story tonight. I was when I was selected for the U.S. Olympic basketball team back in the Paleolithic era. Back in 1964, I thought we'd end up playing the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, in the finals of the Olympic Games. And so I went to a Russian professor here, and I said, could you give me a few words in Russian that I could use in case I get into trouble out there in a game against the Soviets? And he said, well, what do you want to know in Russian? I said, well, how about, hey, big fella, watch out. So he gave me the words in Russian. Sure enough, we get to the finals of the Olympic Games. My man is 6'7", and he weighs about 240. I'm my present height, and I weigh about 195 pounds. About 8 minutes into the game, he cracks me with an elbow up along my upper chest and my lower neck, and I momentarily lose my voice. And then I remember what the professor said. And so I look him right in the eye, put on my meanest face possible, and I say, "Будьте осторожны," which liberally translated means, hey, big fella. Watch out. Now, a funny thing happened, because up until that moment, the Soviets had called all the plays verbally. But after that moment, since they thought I understood Russian, they stopped talking to each other. We went and won the gold medal. So that was the beginning of it, that's for sure. During my years in the Senate, I spent a lot of time on Russia, beginning with your briefing book, Anne-Marie. I thought about it, studied it, traveled there frequently, got to know many Russian leaders, and met many average Russians. I remember I was leading a small delegation to Russia one time, and on the delegation was Bob Kerrey, a senator from Nebraska, and Jim Leach, Princeton graduate here, worked here at the Woodrow School, who was at that time a congressman from Iowa. And as the delegation leader, I had to begin to, shape all the conversations, so I tried to break the ice. We were meeting, it's the time of perestroika, and we were meeting with the largest private chicken producer in Russia, outside St. Petersburg. And so I began, you always try to find some way to hook in with the person on a personal basis, whatever. So I said, well, Mr. Petrov, we have a saying in the United States that those who raise chickens raise hell. And I look at Leach from Iowa and Kerry from Nebraska, and they looked at each other as if to say, we do? But Mr. Petrov went totally blank. Very awkward, said nothing. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. And I said, well, Mr. Petrov, and we went on to talk about chickens and farming and economics. And so when we left there, I said, well, when we had the thing, I asked our interpreter, when we had things with Mr. Petrov, what happened in there? He said, well, your interpreter didn't quite interpret what you said precisely. I said, what do you mean? He said that you said that those who grow chickens go to hell. There are many other stories from the road in Russia, but I won't spend more time talking about them because I have other things I want to say. Clearly, one of my high moments in my 18 years as a U.S. Senator was passing the Freedom Support Act in 1993, which has brought 17,000 high school kids from Russia and the former republics of the Soviet Union to live with American families for a year. And I've kept up with many of the students and have seen how much they learned about America, and about themselves in those years. Well, tonight, I speak with a deep feeling for the U.S.-Russian relationship, for its potential, and about its current state. Some of what I'm going to say, I'm saying for the first time, but it's been in my heart and mind for a while. Tonight, at a time where some say the United States-Russian relationship is the worst it's been in a generation, I will try to get beyond the mythologies and accepted wisdom of an exhausted Cold War paradigm that really limits what's possible for our two countries. I will examine the last 16 years of U.S.-Russian relations, discuss missed opportunities in both sides, outline steps the United States can take that are in our and the world's interest, and argue that this new direction offers the Obama administration a path to achieve a more secure future for all Americans. In the middle of the recent crisis between Russia and Georgia, Senator John McCain said, "We are all Georgians." To which I would reply, no, we're all Americans. And America has worldwide interests at stake, which are different from the emotions that swirl around Georgia. Real leadership requires that we recognize and protect our strategic interests and stop investing age-old ethnic hatreds with far greater importance than they deserve. Russia, which ruled Georgia for over 200 years, until 1991, was not an innocent in the events of the summer of 2008. Obviously, its military crossed into Georgian territory in violation of international law, and I condemn Russia for its action and believe that the invasion and recognition of South Ossetia and Abkhazia have already hurt Russia's long-term interests. But by mounting a massive rocket and tank attack on South Ossetia, whether or not this attack was provoked, Georgia acted recklessly and precipitated the aggressive Russian response. We need Russia to work with us to sharply reduce nuclear weapons, to control nuclear proliferation, to safeguard nuclear materials, to fight the war against Islamic terrorism, to support U.S. infrastructure bonds with their petrodollars, and to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power. All of these are what truly matter to the United States, to our national security interests, and to world peace. Not seeing national interests clearly and following them wisely is how powerful countries make big mistakes. The relevant question now is, will Russia help us to realize those strategic objectives that I just mentioned? Is it still possible at this stage of our relationship, or have the last 16 years made that possibility highly unlikely? The context for the events in Georgia, I don't think, are illuminated by analogies to the Russo-Finnish conflict of the late 30s, or the occupation of the Baltic states in 1941, or the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, or even the Prague Spring and the occupation and invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Understanding what has transpired in U.S.-Russian relations since the end of the Cold War forces us to deal with the effects of our own policies and how they have contributed to this moment. The truth is that we have badly mismanaged our relations with Russia since 1992, and our actions have created a self-fulfilling prophecy of a more contentious relationship between our two countries. Such an outcome was totally unnecessary and can be corrected. The story begins in the Clinton administration with the absence of any effective plan to assist a fallen communist state to move to democratic capitalism, and with a failure to genuinely seek a true strategic partnership with our Cold War adversary. Instead of doing those two things, difficult as they might have been to pull off, we expanded NATO. 14 months ago, when I was in Russia, I saw old friends such as Liberal Democrat Grigory Yavlinsky and communist Gennady Zyuganov, the head of the party, both of whom had run for president of Russia 2 times, in 1996 and 2000. Yavlinsky told me that in 1996 he was out campaigning for president of Russia in the Ural Mountains, and a person came up to him and said, "I thought now the United States was our friend. Are they?" Grigory said, "Certainly they're our friend. The Cold War is over. We have a new relationship." And the Russian citizen looked at him and said, "Well, if they're our friend, why are they expanding a military alliance toward our borders?" My friend, Grigory, former presidential candidate, turned to me and said, "You know, we Russians might not understand puts and calls in finance, but we do understand tanks." NATO is a military alliance that existed to counter the Soviet threat. And when the Soviet Union was gone, what was the purpose of NATO? To this day, there never has been a convincing explanation of why we expanded NATO, or why the interpretation of that Russian citizen in the Urals was wrong. At the time, we argued that NATO membership was a great carrot for the spread of democracy. If a former communist state became democratic, defined as holding open elections, freeing up the press, bringing the military under civilian control, then that state could become eligible to join NATO with its mutual security guarantee. Yet in those days, Russia was also struggling to become a democracy, but its membership in NATO was never seriously considered. We also said that expansion was not aimed at Russia, and that Russia had nothing to fear. Yet at the same time, we argued that it was a hedge against the return of Russian militarism. This seeming contradiction lay at the core of our policy. But were there other explanations for NATO expansion? Was it the only way to promote democracy in Eastern Europe? Did we expand NATO because of our inability to escape old Cold War thinking? Or was it because we accepted advice from Cold War anti-Russian experts who argued that Russia would always be imperialistic? Or did it happen because we were worried about Germany becoming the dominant power in the new Central Europe? Or maybe NATO expanded because of our unwillingness to redefine post-Cold War security arrangements in Europe in a way that put greater faith in the long-term potential of the U.S.-Russian relationship. Or maybe those comfortable with and deeply involved in the bureaucratic business relationships of the organization sought to extend the tenure, extend their tenure by finding a new mission for the organization. Or maybe we were shocked by the indifference of Europe to act against Bosnian genocide and couldn't come up with any other mechanism to respond more rapidly in the future. Or finally, maybe we expanded NATO just because of a failure of imagination. In the absence of new thinking, expansionism and expansion of NATO simply filled the void. During that same trip to Russia, where I talked to Yavlinsky and Zyuganov, I also had a long discussion with Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev told me that at the time of the negotiation between him and Secretary of State Jim Baker about the reunification of Germany and the removal of 300,000 Soviet troops from East Germany, the Russians made clear they didn't want German reunification within NATO. The negotiations went back and forth. Gorbachev told me at one point, Baker looked across the table and said to him, "Look, if you remove your troops and allow unification of Germany in NATO, NATO will not expand 1 inch to the east." Gorbachev also said that Chancellor Helmut Kohl had told him the same thing. After hearing this story, I came back and checked with Secretary Baker. He said that what had transpired in the negotiation on the reunification of Germany was that, at the suggestion of the German Foreign Secretary, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, he had proposed that if the Soviet Union did not oppose German reunification and membership in NATO, the West would not expand NATO 1 inch to the east, which he took to mean into what was then East Germany. As soon as Baker made that proposal, he came back and consulted with President Bush and National Security Advisor Scowcroft, Prince Scowcroft, and within days at the next meeting, he changed the position and said that legally, if Germany was reunified, the United States couldn't say that we won't have NATO troops in East Germany. The negotiation continued back and forth until a compromise was reached that said no non-German NATO troops could be in East Germany, even though German troops connected to the NATO command were permissible. Most of the United States participants in the negotiations say the issue of NATO expansion beyond the borders of Germany didn't even come up at that point. And so this is where you can see how history can tell different stories. Gorbachev says one thing, Baker and Scowcroft say another. All three are honorable men, so who was the one to believe? Then I remembered what Senator Russell Long used to say when he would see somebody speechifying against his position in the Finance Committee. He'd say, well, your lips are saying no, 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 but your eyes are saying yes, yes, yes. Maybe that's what happened here. Baker said one thing, Gorbachev heard another. Given the general nature of Baker's first statement, not 1 inch east, and the context of Gorbachev's meeting with President Bush in Malta earlier that year, in which Bush said that if Gorbachev allowed Eastern Europe to go its own way, the United States would not take advantage, one can see how Gorbachev might have felt Baker was referring to any eastward expansion, not just to expansion into East Germany. And indeed, when I asked Prince Scowcroft, who was the national security advisor for the president, he said that Gorbachev had misinterpreted what Baker said. Well, in 1993, just 3 months after Bill Clinton became president, the presidents of Poland and Czechoslovakia suggested the idea of expanding NATO to their countries, to him, at the dedication of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. In 1994, Clinton introduced the idea at the NATO winter meeting, and the same year Democrats lost control of the Congress, and Clinton faced what appeared to be a tough re-election campaign. In 1995, Clinton made the final decision to expand NATO beyond Germany's borders. And if Reagan had defeated communism and Bush presided over German unification and the dissolution and the end of the Soviet Union, Clinton would unite Europe under a NATO banner. It seemed an objective of sufficient substantive importance, even beyond its obvious appeal to certain American ethnic groups, to be helpful in the re-election campaign. So in my conversation with Gorbachev, I asked him, did President Clinton talk to you before the decision? No. Did he ask to see you when he came to Moscow for the first time, even though you weren't then in office? No. Did any emissary of the administration seek your understanding of the German reunification pledges? No. The fundamental error of NATO expansion was compounded by our arrogance and refusal to engage Russia with respect. At the time, in the mid-90s, the Russian economy was in shambles. 1,500% inflation. 2/3 of the people living in poverty. The GDP dropping 50% in 5 years. Its military had serious deterioration, equipment rotting, nuclear materials leaking, soldiers without paychecks or housing. As an example of how bad things had gotten, the birth rate in the 1990s was on the decline and the death rate was on the rise. By the year 2000, male life expectancy in Russia had dropped to 57 years. But even with their fall from superpower status, the Russian people were still a proud people. And their elites, whether they were in government or the military, had the residual pride of a superpower. In the United States in the 1990s, most policymakers in Washington either ignored Russia, basking in what they called the Cold War victory, or became preoccupied with remaking Russia in the image of a narrow brand of American capitalism. Notable exceptions to this were Senator Richard Lugar and former Senator Sam Nunn, who kept their eyes on the most critical national security issues between our two countries. They worked successfully with both countries to destroy nuclear weapons and secure nuclear stockpiles. And the think tanks, what did most of them do? They arrived at a new Washington consensus, which was Russia's no longer important. Its military's hollowed out, its economy is no bigger than Denmark's and in collapse, its industry hopelessly inefficient, its workers still guided by the old Soviet model, we pretend to work, you pretend to pay. In sum, Russia's influence in a world of market states had disappeared. The attitude was captured in Strobe Talbot's memoir, in which he quoted President Clinton preparing for a meeting with President Yeltsin, saying to his chief Russian advisor, quote, "We keep telling old Boris, now here's what you got to do next. Here's some more shit for your face." Politics 101 says that when somebody with whom you've had an extensive dealings goes bankrupt, what do? You call them up on the phone. You say, "You know, Joe, it's been tough, but you're going to get back. I'm with you. And you know, here's a little help if you want it." That's what you do if you're a good politician, because if the bankrupt individual does get back, you want him to remember your help and your caring. But when Russia was bankrupt in the 1990s, we were neither understanding nor effective in the kind of help we gave them. In 1966, at the height of the Cold War, I was a student at Oxford. It was the second year that the Soviet government had allowed foreigners to drive a car through their territory, their country. Three guys from Oxford and I drove about 1,200 miles that summer through Belarus, Western Russia, Ukraine. We stayed in camping grounds and encountered average Russians each day of the trip. Most had never seen an American before. On more than one occasion, they came up and they said the same thing. "You know, whatever our government says, we just want to thank you for Lend-Lease. That kept us alive in World War II." For the generation that doesn't know, Lend-Lease was a great act of compassion. It helped buffer the Russian people against the hardships of war by giving them food, clothing, and even civilian transportation. During the Cold War, the American government reached out to the people of the Soviet Union with a vision of a better way. But when the Soviet Union came to abrupt end in 1991, we seem to have forgotten the compassionate lesson of Lend-Lease. In our enthusiasm with the changes at the top in Russia, we neglected the enduring Russian grassroots. We increasingly filtered the American vision through one man, the Russian president, Boris Yeltsin. We began to lose contact with the Russian people, and they began to lose confidence in us. Beyond an occasional television speech by a visiting U.S. president, our government stopped trying to communicate with them. And therefore, the Russian people assumed, since we were backing Yeltsin 100%, that whatever he did, we were for. When economic reform created 1,500% inflation, we failed to tell the Russian people that we understood how destructive an impact that it had on their lives, with, among other things, their pensions and life savings being destroyed overnight. During this time, with the exception of the efforts of a private U.S. citizen, George Soros, the U.S. government failed to do anything of significance to help Russians directly or even symbolically. When Yeltsin gave orders for tanks to attack the elected parliament in 1993, we turned a blind eye. And when we simply told Russia's leaders to tighten their nation's economic belt by reducing investment in the social safety net, notwithstanding evident human cost in poverty, unemployment, and lost GDP, we sounded uncaring at best and cruel at worst. Consider this comparison. At Clinton's and Yeltsin's first meeting in 1993 in Vancouver, Clinton offered $1.6 billion to help a Russia whose territory extends through 11 time zones. Compare that with the proposed $1 billion that we're now offering little Georgia. Clinton's offer fell tragically short of the mark. When we, along with other nations, urged the IMF to give substantial support of Russia's budget, only Russian bureaucrats understood the value of that effort. From 1993 to 97, beyond IMF infusions, we provided in total only $4.7 billion in assistance. Not only was American assistance to Russia long on rhetoric and short on impact, but hundreds of millions of it went into the pockets of American consultants, planners, and other scientific tourists who went up and down the learning curve over and over again, even as billions more of IMF money was stolen by the ruling elite of Russia. Only pennies actually reached the Russian people. Not only did we fail to influence the course of Russian reform, we actually created an anti-American backlash built on hyped and then dashed expectations. Now, what could we have done instead? And I'm not going to get into the game of second-guessing here, so I'll just describe what I actually suggested at the time. We should have had a highly focused set of programs with a noticeable impact on the lives of individuals, like Lend-Lease had on the lives of those families in the campgrounds that I met in 1966. I'm not talking about a big Marshall Plan. That wouldn't have helped anybody because only Russia was in charge of making its economy efficient. Only Russia could institute the rule of law that would attract foreign capital. But we could have targeted a highly visible approach to help solve very real problems so that when the situation improved, everybody in the country would know that it was the United States wishing them well and coming to help them at a moment of their greatest need. Well, what could have been such a program? In the early 1990s, there were 40 million people in 86 Russian cities breathing air with over 10 times the maximum allowable concentration of various pollutants. 40 million, 86, 10 times. Official Russian statistics identified 15% of the Russian territory, home of over 30 million people, as, quote, an environmental disaster zone. Descriptions of Magnitogorsk, perhaps the most heavily polluted city on earth, come right out of the hellscape of Hieronymus-Bosch. America's response to this was woefully inadequate. Instead of feasibility studies and action plans on 100 different subjects, and I used to call these efforts the Consultants Full Employment Act, our money, what little there was, would have been better spent had we simply bought and installed scrubbers on some of the coal-fired power plants with big "Made in America" signs on them. For less than $1 billion, American aid could have led directly to Russian kids breathing cleaner air and knowing why. The absence of such program, and there could have been many others that would have touched average Russians at a reasonable cost, was a policy blunder of colossal proportions. In adopting an arrogant and unfeeling policy toward Russia, we seem to have forgotten that before the Cold War ended, the leadership of Ronald Reagan and George Shultz and George Bush and Jim Baker and Brent Scowcroft had to be reciprocated by Mikhail Gorbachev and Evert Shevardnadze before the Cold War could end. Indeed, a genuine partnership existed between the two sets of leaders. We forgot that a country with a continental territory, 11 time zones, vast national resources, and a proud people could never be counted out. We forgot that someday oil could soar to over $120 a barrel. In 2000, a new American president came to office, which was a chance to make a change. But things went off track fairly early. President Clinton had expanded NATO to Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary. Now President Bush expanded NATO to former territories of the Soviet Union, the 3 Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. The Russians protested, as they had the first expansion of NATO. We told them they had nothing to fear for this latest enlargement because it wasn't aimed at them. We reiterated that it was just the inexorable march of democracy. Besides, after we offered our explanations, what could they do about it? We were powerful, they were weak. And to demonstrate our power, Vice President Cheney later went to the Baltic states and gave a provocative anti-Russian speech. After September 11th, the first world leader to telephone President Bush was the new president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. He offered sympathy and solidarity, and at the UN, Russia supported the blank check resolution to go after al-Qaeda and the Taliban, a resolution that allowed us to take all necessary steps in Afghanistan in response to the attacks of September 11th. Without Russia's active support on that resolution, China might not have come on board. On top of that, Russia facilitated the flow of supplies in our efforts to organize anti-Taliban forces and factions in Afghanistan, and suggested other ways that we might further our efforts there based on their bitter 10-year experience in the same country. Putin even approved the United States using military bases in the former states of the Soviet Union known as the stands, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, to aid our efforts against the Taliban. For this help, President Bush showed his gratitude by abrogating the ABM Treaty and seeking to make those bases in the stands a permanent part of the United States worldwide base architecture. He even sent U.S. military missions to some of these states in Central Asia. There was a trend developing here that even unbiased observers could see: insensitivity to real human suffering during the Russian depression, expansion of NATO, first to Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, and then to the Baltic states, expansion of the U.S. military presence in Central Asia. The next step on the path to where we are today came when the Bush administration decided to place components of a missile defense radar system in Poland and the Czech Republic. We told Russia the shield wasn't aimed at them. When the Russians pointed out that the radar covered about 40% of their territory, we protested, no, no, no. We said the shield is meant only to protect Europe from Iran. This was our argument. Even though Europe hadn't asked for the protection, and even though Iran had no nuclear weapons or reliable ability to deliver those nuclear weapons to the heartland of Europe. Our argument simply wasn't credible. And the Russians exposed our insincerity when they offered one of their biggest and most sophisticated radars just north of Azerbaijan as a substitute for building radar stations in Poland and the Czech Republic. Since our stated threat was Iran, the Russian radar station would have caught the trajectory of any missile that might have been developed someday by the Iranians at least 8 minutes sooner than it would have been caught by radars in Poland or Czechoslovakia. Well, we sent our Air Force teams to discuss the technical aspects of the radar station. They said the facility was impressive, but replied that the Russians' offer just was not going to work out. We kind of rope-a-doped them and said, no thanks, we'll build our own. One suspects we didn't want the Russians to be able to disarm the system by closing down our access at a critical point. Once again, our fears trumped the chance to build a joint defense effort. And then came Kosovo. Unlike the well-prepared Bosnian negotiations that came after marshaling international opinion against appalling Serbia atrocities and carefully planning multilateral discussions and forming a multilateral force, including Russians under the Partnership for Peace, this time we simply bombed Belgrade without UN approval, deployed NATO forces to separate Serbs and Albanians, and then provided massive humanitarian aid to the Albanian Kosovars. While there's no question that the Serbs had committed brutal violence against Albanians, we seem to ignore the murders and violence committed by the Kosovo Liberation Army, an ethnic Albanian army, against the Serbs. Well, a UN resolution was passed. An ethnic Albanian government essentially took de facto control of Kosovo, which was kind of an autonomous region of Serbia, not unlike northern Iraq, which has Kurds in control, even as it's a part of Iraq. Stability, though, was at hand. Historical Serbian religious sites in Kosovo seemed as if they were going to be secure. Then the Kosovars demanded independence from Serbia on the grounds of ethnic self-determination. President Bush visited the capital and was greeted by large crowds waving American flags and pro-Bush placards. The Kosovars argued that they were similar to America when it sought its independence from England. President Bush enthusiastically supported Kosovo independence. Well, what really happened here was the old pattern of people wanting their own country simply because of ethnicity. That powerful pull began to intensify, as it had all over Europe in 1919 with the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. No one bothered to point out that the founding of America was not an ethnically self-conscious enterprise. It was based solely on democratic ideas and a spirit of tolerance which welcomed all people within its borders. As Americans, we believe in self-determination, but we shouldn't support ethnic separatism masquerading in the name of self-determination. Well, the Russians strenuously objected to Kosovo independence, and a moment of walking in their shoes would tell you why. Their country has over 100 ethnic groups, Chechens being among them. Many are regionally concentrated. Naturally, the Russians were fearful of a precedent being set for ethnic separatism throughout their vast country, but especially in the perpetually boiling Caucasus. Such separation, like that pursued in Kosovo, could turn the map of Russia into something that looked like Swiss cheese. The Russians vociferously objected, and meeting after meeting at the proposed Independence Day approached. All we had to do was to keep the existing UN resolution in place and not insist on total separatism. But we didn't. Finally, Russians said that if we went ahead with Kosovo independence, they would begin to look where they could apply the principles that we were establishing, specifically mentioning South Ossetia and Abkhazia, two provinces of Georgia, which, ever since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which controlled it for 200 years before, in 1991, had wanted their independence due to deep ethnic hatred of Georgians. We seemed oblivious to the Russian warnings, blinded by the fact that they were weak and we were strong. And along with much of Europe, we recognized the independence of Kosovo. Interestingly, Spain voted against it because they feared the effect of the precedent on the Basque separatist movement in their country. With Kosovo independence, for the first time since the Helsinki Accords in 1975, a territory had been taken from a nation against its expressed desires. The doctrine of mutual consent was dead. Well, politicians patted themselves on the back, gave speeches about freedom and democracy, seemingly oblivious to the fact that we had just set ourselves up for future trouble in Georgia, or maybe even Ukraine, where the eastern part of the country is overwhelmingly ethnic Russian, while the western part of the country is ethnically Ukrainian, and where the Crimea, home to thousands of Russian naval retirees, had been part of Russia until the 1950s, when Khrushchev, a Ukrainian Russian, put it into the Ukrainian Republic of the Soviet Union. Well, what conclusion can you draw from this saga of ethnic conflict that goes back thousands of years? Once you try to shape it, manipulate it, make it turn out according to this principle or that principle, you play with fire. Once the genie of ethnic separatism comes out of the bottle, its expressions become totally unpredictable. Well, as someone who's invested a lot of time and hope in what was possible with the U.S.-Russian relationship, I feel the last 16 years produced a series of strategic blunders leading to a gigantic missed opportunity. Unfortunately, the only thing the Russians have gotten out of this period, beyond regular consultations between the militaries of our two countries, seems to be membership in G8, which is a kind of glorified talking club that doesn't have much power at all. Just a lot of photo opportunities with staff negotiating bland general documents which principals sign with solemn pomp. Well, in sum, look what's happened in the last 16 years. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union removed its troops from Germany and Eastern Europe without a shot. The Soviet Union itself ended. Communism was dead. Russians, with whom we had never had a territorial conflict, were seeking a workable long-term relationship with us based on shared interests. What did we do? We said no to their opposition to NATO expansion. We said no to their opposition to NATO expansion to the states of the former Soviet Union. We left the ABM Treaty and unilaterally renounced formal arms control negotiations. We said no to their opposition to missile shields in Poland and the Czech Republic. We said no to their opposition to Kosovo independence. We expanded our military presence into Central Asia. We sent advisors and military equipment to Georgia. We acted unilaterally without real consultation time after time, but especially in Iraq when we invaded a country. Even the so-called strategy paper signed by Presidents Bush and Putin in 1908 was nothing more than a document about future areas of negotiation. After years of shutting Russia out of power discussions, ignoring their pleas about how they saw their own national interests and what they wanted for genuine partnership, the events in Georgia cannot be a surprise. Some say last summer's events in Georgia proved the wisdom of NATO expansion. I say the expansion of NATO, plus all the other mistakes we've made, created a self-fulfilling prophecy that has so far denied us the long-term advantages of a closer partnership with Russia. The question for the United States is whether we can start anew with Russia after 16 years of neglect and mismanagement. Can we truly engage them to be our partner on the big strategic questions that will shape the 21st century? I remember talking to a Chinese one time, and he said, "Why are you Americans so interested in small countries? What about the big countries?" And Russia is a big country. On the big strategic questions of the 21st century, any hope for partnership, or even just a sound working relationship, given the last 16 years, must recognize the legitimate interests of each country and the specific obligations that each accepts to realize a more stable world. Sadly, I would say that instead of having a history of cooperation against the threat of Islamic terrorism to the south of Russia, are charting a cooperative energy strategy, are sharing ideas on controlling Iran's nuclear program, or understanding how Russia sees China when Russia has only 7 million people east of the Urals and China has millions of people already in Russia farming illegally and 1.2 billion people who need more living space, instead of talking to Russia about these issues, reaching some common understandings, and taking some collective actions, we have what we have today. While Russia no longer espouses an ideology of world revolution, a U.S.-Russian rivalry will make the achievement of our big objectives in the world more difficult and will make the world a more dangerous place and make America less secure. Russia's never going to mirror the United States. I mean, I remember giving my first speech about Putin's hostile intentions toward Russian democracy in 2001. Russians will always chart their own way. To us, Russians seem inexplicably to have given up political freedoms without a whisper of protest. Putin and Medvedev remain very popular. The Soviet Gulag and the Ukrainian famine are episodes of the past, but the speed with which authoritarianism has reasserted itself seems startling, with the effect being felt most directly by the Russian people themselves. But there are still important things that we can do together. If we can get close cooperation and results that move toward elimination or sharp reduction of nuclear weapons, prevention of nuclear proliferation, safeguarding of nuclear materials, assistance in the war against radical Islamic terrorism, investment of Russian petrodollars, even though they're declining, in U.S. infrastructure, and help with blocking Iranian nuclear development, the world will be a safer place. If the cost of getting that genuine convergence of strategic interest and results on the ground is giving up radars in Poland or the Czech Republic and being honest about the very unlikely prospects of Ukrainian membership in NATO, I would say it's a small price to pay. After all, it was the first President Bush who in 1991 speech in Kiev had cautioned the former states of the Soviet Union against what he called suicidal nationalism. For any of this to happen, we have to treat the Russian government with respect and as an equal. We have to listen closely to their concerns, to build bridges between our two peoples, and regularly put ourselves in their shoes. On the Russian side, they've got to be flexible. They've got to have flexibility and goodwill toward our intentions and tangible progress in the areas of our mutual strategic interest. The hostile pride and needless gamesmanship on their part that now infuses too many diplomatic discussions with them must give way to a genuine search for common ground. The knee-jerk bluster of past times does not further an agenda of productive cooperation between our two countries. Russia must see how the invasion of Georgia propelled a skeptical Polish government, at first doubtful about missile defense radar on their soil, to agree to the radar out of fear. That action, in turn, produced in the best tit-for-tat tradition, President Medvedev's promise of short-range missiles in Kaliningrad. The Russian president's calculatedly bellicose speech delivered on the day of President Obama's election to a stolid, perfunctorily clapping audience produced overtones of the Soviet past. And I found myself saying, oh, please, not that, not now. At a time of a new United States president, the Russians should be trying to create a space for maximum flexibility to undo the mistakes of the Clinton and Bush years, not narrowing the new president's options by resorting to unnecessarily short-sighted challenges. Both of our futures would be better if each of us had more restraint. It's my opinion that Russia wants to be left alone to figure out how to modernize this country. As long as they don't try to control their neighbors or dictate regimes, they shouldn't have to fear foreign military bases in their neighboring countries. Russia wants to be Western and Eastern oriented simultaneously. A majority of Russians consider themselves Eurasians, not Europeans or Asians. That means Russia is unique politically, culturally, and strategically. To try to jam them into our cultural or political box at the expense of a closer working relationship on big issues central to each of our long-term security seems to me to be particularly short-sighted and self-defeating. Some say Russia will always be an imperial power seeking to control its neighbors militarily. I say it can be a responsible 21st century state that plays an important role in building a more stable world. But first, we have to truly engage with each other. Any genuine strategic working relationship is going to require courageous leadership in the United States. Because as we saw after the Russian military moved into Georgia, the old Cold War reflex remains ready at hand. And it also does in Russia. For many Americans, the old anti-communism is beginning to evolve into an anti-Russian sentiment. A familiar fever can once again return, just as it can among old Russian Cold Warriors. In the last 16 years, that fever disappeared. It'll be on the rise again, unless we see that there are opportunities to escape the past, that history is not determinative of the future, that we are in control of our destiny, that we can shape a more productive U.S.-Russian relationship by what we do and what we say, by seizing the opportunity. Well, what are the chances of any of this happening? Aren't the old divisions reasserting their power over our imagination? And I say with the deepest conviction, that need not be the case. Remember at the beginning I told you about the Freedom Support Act, one of the good things that came out of the Clinton years, for sure. The exchange program that I started in 1992 has now brought 17,000 high school students to live for a year with American families, allowing them to understand America for themselves and to return to Russia and tell their friends and neighbors and family members about their American experience. It's the only program that touches all 47 oblasts of Russia. In other words, it's all over Russia. Anytime I go to Russia, I try to meet with alumni of these exchanges. Today, they're moving up. One of them become an assistant to the Commerce Secretary of Russia. One's high in the stock exchange in Moscow. In Ukraine, one is now a member of parliament. Many work for international companies. A lot of them are teachers. Many have started nonprofits. Incredible kids. When they complete their year in America, I've asked them from time to time, many of them, to write me letters and tell me about their experience in the United States. In closing, I'd like to read you a letter excerpt from Maria Sankova of Nizhny Novgorod. She wrote, "Seems like a day ago I walked out of the plane into a strange place where everything was so interesting and different from my life in Russia. And now I call New Orleans, before Katrina, my second home. And I really love this magic city. The word host family doesn't exist anymore. They're just my dear American family, and I am their Russian daughter. These people are some of my closest friends in the world now. My two families write to each other in different languages, but they have a little bridge now. That's what my Russian dad calls me. No more family, friends, or relatives in Russia think of the USA as the enemy or the foreign country. It's just another place where people live and love and work and have fun. We're all children of Big Mother Earth. We all share it. We all shall. To which I say, Amen. Let us, both American and Russian, follow this dream and make it a lasting reality. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we'll do a few questions. Let me tell you, I like to do questions. Okay, you raise your hand, I'll call on you. If I don't know the answer to the question, or I don't want to answer it, I'll go like that. You put your hand down, I'll call on somebody else. Yes. Yes, you. It just was.
It just was.
It just was. Yes. I don't disagree with your analysis. I think that it's very clear that many Russians feel that the simultaneous economic liberalization, decontrol of prices, for example, that led to 1,500% inflation, and the rough and tumble politics that were democratic, certainly, but that resulted, among other things, in the rise of the oligarchs and the control of great public resources by a few people, has fallen on bad times in the minds of Russians. And the amazing thing to me is, here's Putin. He has essentially, and Medvedev now, who've essentially retracted a lot of the individual freedoms that existed in the mid-1990s. And the Russian people are, they say that they're two of the most popular leaders in the world. And that has to do in part with Russian standard of living has increased since it plummeted into a depression. Imagine, we're here talking in a financial crisis about inflation, 1,500% inflation, 2/3 of the population in poverty, 50% of the GDP gone. Not growing at 1% as opposed to 1.5%, but gone. And he came in, and the Yeltsin people came in, and they enacted the reforms, came to a financial crisis in 1998, and came Putin. Putin made the decision. And since then, with the luck of oil prices that continued to skyrocket, and now they're in a little more trouble. 50% of the budget of Russia comes from oil revenue. And therefore, they've had a rising standard of living with high growth for the last 7 to 8 years. And so people have begun to say, well, our living standard is better. People who are in the political process obviously lament it. Grigory Yavlinsky, he can't run. Gennady Zyuganov, who's the head of the Communist Party, told me it's impossible. He has all the right programs, from his view, but he has no way to communicate them to the Russian public because he can't get on television. And then Putin passed the law saying you can't criticize your political opponent. So, there's no question of what's going on here. And the real issue for me is, in the context of what you asked and said, is what happens if the economy in Russia starts to contract dramatically? And that is what bothers me, and I think it's an unforeseen event. Right now, the loss of these political freedoms are on some levels, from a Western's perspective, despicable, particularly the attack on the press and free expression of ideas. But, you know, except for those who are directly involved, the Russian people say, well, things are better, and they're better than they were 10 years ago. If they're no longer better, then it's a new day. Yes? Our main concern with Russia is that they're the second largest nuclear power in the world. And we're interested in reducing that arsenal dramatically. President Reagan wanted to eliminate it. As you heard in the speech, was deciding as I was delivering it whether I was going to say eliminate or sharply reduce. I said sharply reduce. But yeah, sharply reducing nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles, missiles, and helping counter nuclear proliferation, because if there's one area that should give us all chills, it was the reason the Nunn-Lugar bill was passed in the first place, because we were worried about leakage of nuclear materials to terrorists out of Russia, where they were in the middle of a depression and couldn't maintain their infrastructure. And then making sure nuclear stockpiles are safe and taken care of. And those are the big nuclear issues. But there are others. I mean, you know, 10 years ago when I would talk with Russians, and this was Perestroika and Gorbachev, and you know, it was just moving ahead. And I've had conversations with them. Why can't we have a serious dialogue about what we perceive to be our mutual strategic interest, assuming you don't feel a threat from the West, and you've got a modus vivendi with China in the East, at least for now, then aren't we both concerned about the same thing, which is Islamic terrorism in the South? And let's cooperate on that, and let's share information. And they haven't been fully willing to do that, but how could they in the current climate? And so there are very real and important things that we can do together to make the world a more stable place. And the military part of it is at the center. Oh, Mr. Ambassador, this is our former ambassador to Moscow, who is Jack Matlock, resident of Princeton, and probably one of the most astute and knowledgeable observers and pundits on Russia that exists.
Thank you for the kind words. I did want to say that I totally adore everything you said. I think it's one of the most insight I have right on definitions of what we need to do against the relationship and what has gone wrong. My question is, looking at the initial formation of the Obama administration, what do you think of the process that President Obama is practically speaking going to be able to do about some of the problems he can? The reason I ask are our Vice President-elect really engineered partially through the Senate the whole approval of the NATO expansion at a time when many of us were arguing against it, making it very plain that you made at the time. We will have a Secretary of State who was very influential in the Russian administration, so many of these mistakes were made. And even though President-elect Obama has endorsed such things as the Schultz-Kissinger initiative on nuclear weapons, we're not going to make any of that work unless we get this relationship with Russia back on the right track. How do you see this? Are they going to be able to correct some of the attitudes that in the past have understood?
I think that you mentioned two of the players. There are two other players, which is General Jones, who's the National Security Advisor, who's an extremely balanced person, who has a wide range of conceptual ability, and who's been on the ground all over the world, and who can make judgments about military efficiency and effect, say, for example, the radars. And Bob Gates, who, I was on the Senate Intelligence Committee for 8 years. For 4 of those years, I had a special Russian task force, and he was at the CIA and would be the leader to come visit with me every week. So he knows Russia cold, and he is not going to, I think he will see opportunities here in an Obama administration that he couldn't see in a Bush administration that was dominated by the neoconservatives. And I think he'll be practical, and he's got, I think, a good head, and there are things that can be done. I think he understands there are things that can be done. So on the radar in Poland and Czechoslovakia, I really can't buy any argument that I've read. I invite someone, please tell me, please give me an argument as to why these are essential to our security, or even Germany's, or even France's. So I don't know, I still don't know why they were even suggested. I think those are easy things for an Obama administration to, as the president-elect has said, do to reset the relationship. Ukraine is a little more difficult, but the reality is today Ukraine wouldn't qualify for NATO membership because over 50% of the people don't want to go into NATO. And that is before we get to this whole ethnic danger within Ukraine itself. So I think that the path that an Obama administration could take on that issue is it could say, the first thing should be membership in the European community, the EU, the European Union, which brings with it all the economic advantages. So do I think that will happen? I don't think it's an impossibility. I think if you see what President-elect Obama has done on economic policy, he's put the Larry Summers and Geithner in the administration. They have a particular point of view. He's got Paul Volcker on the outside, who has his own commission that will not be necessarily in agreement. And I think that what President Obama has demonstrated is he reaches out to a wide number of people. And as he said, he provides the vision. It's not the Secretary of Defense or Treasury or whomever. So I can see him taking the decision once he's been fully briefed and sees the alternatives that could lead to real progress in the relationship with Russia, because it's not a difficult thing to do. There have been so many mistakes made. It's not a difficult thing to do to put this back on track, and from the Russians' perspective, have it work better. Yes?
What I don't understand is why we didn't understand in the early 90s about the non-expansion of NATO's one initiative. It's not formal.
Well, that's, Ambassador Matlock might speak to that with deeper experience than I. But I might ask you, Jack, if you want to say something. But what I would say is that, when you're in negotiations, you have the lawyers who write the language, right, that are formal, and then you judge people's intentions. It's partly body language, what they say. Somebody says, you formed a relationship, I promise you this, or we'll do that, or we won't do this. It tends to create a context for this. And Jack you might talk about the context of Malta, and you might talk about the context of the issue, what if Gorbachev had been precise, right? What if he had been precise and said, I thought I had that in my speech, but what if he'd been precise and said, we want to clarify this. When you say 1 inch further east, that means east of Germany in addition to into East Germany. But it didn't happen. So, it's why it's such a human human process. Do you want to add anything to that, John?
I think that's essentially right. I think what one has to understand was that what was said was not said as a commitment. However, it reflected an attitude and a policy which had been building from, I would say, the latter part of the Reagan administration to the Bush administration, is that we were going to put aside the geopolitical confrontations of the Cold War. And if Gorbachev would accept democracy in Eastern Europe, and even push democracy in his own country, we were not going to seem to contest that by moving in a way that would seem to their geopolitical disadvantage. And we convinced him of that. And that made it politically possible for him to do the things he did in 1989 and 1990.
Yeah.
Now, when we were debating NATO expansion, those who were pushing this, including our Vice President-elect, would not even ask the administration to see the memorandum of conversation in which these comments were made. They simply tried to deep six them and ignore all of this background, when it was very clear that if we used what was a Cold War instrument and moving it in Europe, it was going, practically speaking, to make democracy in Russia and a Russia as a full supporter for European security impossible in the long run. And that was simply ignored, and I don't know what Senator Bradley's opinion is, but my opinion is it was done for domestic political reasons. Because President Clinton knew it was going to be a tight race in '96. He needed Polish votes in states like Pennsylvania and Illinois, and that was all that really mattered.
Well, I don't particularly agree with that. I think that since he said that he wanted to have NATO expansion first in the winter of 1994, that was before the elections in November 1994. And so I think that what he wanted was a big idea, like President Reagan and President Bush, and this was his big idea. Now, it had maybe on second thought or secondary or tertiary political benefit from ethnic groups, but I think it was the big idea that was the political payoff.
Senator, you talked about the hopeful side of Obama, the new administration, et cetera. Is Putin the same Putin that George Bush saw through to his soul?
I think that was more comment on George Bush than on Vladimir Putin. I mean, you know, Putin is a tough customer. He's he wants to have his country modernized and wants to have the standard of living increase. When you have negotiations, it's not going to be a walk in the park, but there's no reason why you can't hammer out agreements that are of mutual interest if you have clarity of thought and if you're willing to put yourself walking in the other person's shoes for a while. And then if you're willing to test that by saying, okay, here's the agreement. Now, we've had the press conference. Now, where's the results? Let's see the results on the ground. And then you go to another and to another. And then with every agreement that you get that works, that changes something on the ground, more confidence is built and more things you can do. So I think that Putin is probably going to be there for a while. And I think Medvedev will be there for a while. Whether one or the other will be president remains to be seen. Yeah. Is that it? Okay, well, I'd like to thank the Woodrow Wilson School and Anne-Marie for making this possible and all of you for coming. I said, look, I want to come down and give this speech if possible. Do you think anybody would come? And she said, I don't know. So I want to thank all of you.
I'm actually going to invite them to a reception. What I actually said to Senator Bradley was that the students, the last day of term is tomorrow, and that if I remembered my undergraduate days, they often got out of town just a little bit before the final day of classes. But I said I was certain we would have an audience, and I want to thank all of you as our audience. Often, this is the last event of this semester, and to celebrate it and to thank all of you, the Office of Community Relations, which has also co-sponsored this talk, and the Woodrow Wilson School are hosting a reception in the Bernstein Gallery downstairs. So if you'd like a little holiday cheer before heading out into the rain, please go downstairs to the gallery. And before you do, let me say to Senator Bradley that he is welcome at this podium anytime, and we thank him.